all of you for being here so bright and shiny after the way you partied until 7 o'clock last night with us. We really are just blown away by the energy you all have. It was a busy day yesterday. I think the common response that I got from everyone was that they felt like their heads were going to explode. There was so much new that they were learning. And I kept being like Mayor Koch, going around saying, how are we doing? How are we doing? How are we doing? Because of course the goal, we're data geeks here, and the measurable goal that we're going to measure ourselves on is, did you get 2 new ideas here that you, or more, would be happy if you got more, that you could take back and apply to your work to make it stronger? And so far, what I'm hearing now, maybe people, are just telling me to my face, but what I'm hearing is that those new ideas are coming. So that's really good. I'm Beth Babcock. I am the head of Economic Mobility Pathways, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to what's going to be a really wonderful, wonderful day. If you thought yesterday was good, I think, as we say in Boston, today is going to be even better. It's going to be much better. It's going to be friggin' awesome is what it's going to be. So we're really glad to have you with us. And, it is just a real pleasure and an honor to have, starting our day for us, Mayor Martin J. Walsh of Boston. Mayor Walsh is a lifelong champion of working people and a proud product of the city of Boston. His vision is of a thriving, healthy, and innovative Boston, a city with equality and opportunity for everyone. Since taking office in 2014, Mayor Walsh has focused on strengthening Boston's schools, adding hundreds of high-quality pre-kindergarten seats, funding extended learning time, and securing tuition-free community college for the graduates of Boston public schools. Talk about a champion, right? At the same time, he's created powerful tools for low-income workers, including a Learn and Earn Job Apprentice program and an Office of Financial Empowerment. In partnership with nonprofit partners and private employers, the mayor has created Boston Hires, which is working toward ensuring 20,000 low-income Boston residents are trained and placed in good-paying jobs by 2022. He's the founding vice chair of the Cities of Opportunity Task Force at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and in that way, elevating the national conversation about income inequality. The Walsh administration has also addressed the tremendous need for housing in the city with an ambitious plan for creating new affordable and middle-class homes. He's led the city to reaching 98% of its production goal of 53,000 units of affordable housing by 2030. Before taking office, Mayor Walsh served in the Massachusetts House of Representatives and also made his mark as a labor leader. Raised by immigrant parents, Mayor Walsh is driven to make sure that Boston is a city where anyone can overcome their challenges and fulfill their dreams. He has said, Boston will be at its best when all its residents have the support and opportunity they need to thrive. We are, yes. We are deeply grateful to Mayor Walsh for serving as this year's honorary co-chair of our Disrupting the Poverty Cycle conference. As you can see, we are fortunate indeed to be in Boston and to live in a city led by someone who cares so deeply about our issues. It is my honor to introduce Mayor Martin J. Walsh, Mayor of Boston.
Thank you very much, Beth, and I appreciate you being here today, and I appreciate having this conference here today in our city, and thank everyone for being here this morning. I don't know if anyone had a chance. We had a little parade. Anyone who's not from Boston? We had a little parade yesterday in Boston. Anybody from LA here, by the way? Or Houston? Or New York? All right, sorry, Yankee guys. But anyway, we had a little parade yesterday, and it was great in the city. It was wicked awesome, so I want to thank you for that. But it was fun for the city of Boston. And before I get started, I want to thank the board and all the staff at EMPath for the great work that you do disrupting the cycle of poverty. It's so important that we do that as cities around America. Beth talked about my role in the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and I work with all of the mayors. I know there's people from all over the country, I think, here and all over the world, but I work with mayors all over the country and all over the world. And one of the biggest things we talk about is poverty and inequality, and how do we make our cities equal for everyone and opportunities. So I want to thank everyone here today for the great work that you do. I'm proud that this conference is being held here in Boston, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've done here in the city. We're a city that prides ourselves on global leadership in inequality and climate and a whole bunch of other areas. So I want to thank you. Boston's a thriving city, as you saw when you came here today. If you landed on a plane and you looked in, you saw cranes. If you look and you drove here, you saw all kinds of construction. So we're thriving. We're a diverse city. 28% of the people that live in the city of Boston were born in another country, like my parents. 48% of the people in the city are first generation, like I am, Americans. 51% of the people who live in our city are people of color. 52% of our households are led by women. So when you think about the numbers that we have in the city, it's important to understand what's the breakdown of your city, because many of those stats I just gave you, they're great stats to have in the city, but when you think about inequality, they're also leading in inequality, the folks that I just mentioned. And it's important to recognize and understand that, and that we have to tackle the issue, we have to understand where the challenges are, where the problems are, and how do we do better. Our population is growing. Our unemployment rate is under 4%. The quality of life and public health indicators are among the best in the nation here in Boston, and inequality is trending in the right direction as well. It's something that when I became the mayor in 2014, the Brookings Institute did a study, a study and analysis of the inequality cities in America and ranked them. And in 2014, Boston was ranked #1. And that number is, I want to be #1 in a lot of things, but that's not where I want to be #1. And that number really bothered me. And we started to think about, as we started to set up the new organization, the new government, if you will, in the city, we thought about how do we tackle the issue of inequality? How do we truly make sure that Boston's a city that everyone can thrive, healthy, innovative city that people can thrive in? So we sat down, we understood the data and the disparities. You know that because of the work you do every single day. We have disparities in race, gender, and class. And this conversation I'm giving here this morning could be a conversation in almost any city in America that the mayor or a leader or anyone can get up and have the same conversation that I'm having today. Disparities are in access to both the drivers and the benefits of our growth. So the big economic picture is important, but success has a means of a way forward. We have to continue to think about how do we take that success. We need to make sure that it's fair and sustainable. Otherwise, it won't be fair and it won't be sustainable as we continue to move forward. And disrupting will not be an option. Shared prosperity has stalled in the United States of America. Half of those born in the 1980s earn less than their parents did. And we haven't made serious dent in poverty since the 1960s, when a lot of programs were created. There may be global forces that are hard to control, but certainly these are national policies that we should be advancing and really tackling the issues in front of us. That political work should be all we invest in. But in the meantime, cities are in the position to be able to move forward. And that's one of the things we've been saying a lot lately, is that regardless of what's happening on the national scale and all of the noise that's happening in Washington, and it's not good noise, and nothing good coming out of there right now, we have to take the responsibility. What you're doing here today, and cities need to step up and take this responsibility. We need to advance new ideas. We need to come up with new tools. We need new partnerships for reducing poverty and restoring economic mobility. In Boston, we've taken that role seriously. 5 years ago, we didn't have a city plan. The last plan that we had was a master plan from 1965. It focused on economic development and it focused on downtown. So when you look out the window later on, you'll see the downtown skyline. That's what came out of our economic development plan in 1965. So we launched a new plan with broader mandates. Working with residents, we defined goals and set out a vision of inclusive growth in our city. That means growth that everyone can be part of and everyone should be part of, in their education, in their work, in the quality of life. It's called Imagine Boston 2030, and you can find it online. We have it online for you to look at. It looks at more than economic development. It looks at housing. It looks at education. It looks at transportation. It looks at open space. It looks at climate resilience. It looks at access to arts and culture, everything that we need to work together to create inclusive, sustainable opportunities here. It's not just a long-term plan. It's a plan that informs us on our work every single day. It's a living, breathing document that we can change. We can bring new pieces in. We can take new pieces out. We can constantly use that plan as a guide of how do we move forward. For the individual or family living in our city, inclusive growth means economic mobility. So we've made it a top priority in all of our policy work. We've created an economic mobility lab in my office. We're looking at existing programs and we're piloting new ideas to see how we can close racial gaps, promote mobility, and in the end of the day, be a stronger city. The goal is to meet people right at the right time, put together our programs, touch every point along the pathways from early childhood to career. We're expanding high-quality pre-kindergarten seats. In 4 years, we've expanded it up to over 1,000 seats. Our goal is universal pre-kindergarten in the city of Boston. We're working with nonprofits. I know the Boys and Girls Club of Dorchester was here. They were sitting on our task force looking at how do we grow pre-kindergarten but not take away from the organizations that are doing it today that aren't part of our school. We came up with a plan that works. How do we create pathways for our pre-kindergartens that will be going to a private setting, and when they come to first grade, that they have a pathway into our school? It's important for us to do it. We've expanded our free child savings account. It's called Boston Saves, to reach every 5-year-older in the city of Boston, because as you know, the studies show that young people that have child savings account, when they get to college age, they're more likely to go to college, and the family's more likely to invest in college. So it's an encouragement to get more young people into college. We're expanded our private sector youth summer jobs by 18% to make sure that we have our young people have an opportunity and these jobs have real impacts. Over 11,000 young people have worked this summer, and we've been able to increase that number every year in private settings and working for the city to be able to understand moving forward. We now provide free community college to low-income high school graduates. It's a program that we're using mitigation from all of the development that's happening in the city of Boston. We're working with three junior colleges in Boston, and we have a pathway. Kids can actually go to free community college, and we're working with Boston University, and we're working with Mass Maritime and UMass Boston that we're in today for other opportunities so we can get our young people into college to finish that 4-year degree and try not to overburden them with tuitions and have loans as they move forward. We created a program called Boston Builds Credit, helping 25,000 residents achieve prime credit scores by the year 2025. We're sitting down and giving them the opportunity to understand what it means to have good credit, what it means to have good understanding of economics, what it means to move forward, because some people can't access homes, can't buy homes, can't buy things that they need for their family, and can't advance their family because of damage to their credit scores. We created the office's first Office of Workforce Development, settling a goal to get 20,000 residents in good-paying jobs by the year 2022. Not minimum wage jobs, good-paying jobs. Understanding they can raise a family and pay for a family in doing that. We've also expanded our small business programs in the city and made it sure that worker-owned companies get tailored support from our Office of Economic Development. All of these programs that we do are evidence-based. All of them operate through partnerships, and all of them reflect our citywide commitment to moving the people of Boston forward. As a result, as a city, we are making progress. A recent report by the Boston Foundation found that Boston is tied for number 2 among U.S. cities for economic mobility. For African Americans, we are number 1 in mobility. For Latinos, we're in the top 10. So we need to continue to make sure, as we talk about our diverse city, making sure that as our ship raises, everyone raises with that ship. Unfortunately, being the best in the United States right now is not a high standard to claim success. That's one of the things that we can't lose sight of. Those Black and Latino incomes may be rising, but they're significantly lower than their white counterparts. So we're looking for bigger levers to move forward. Probably the greatest challenge we have to mobility is in Boston is the housing costs. We have a housing shortage built up over many years, something that in 2014, when I became the mayor, I quickly found that out. God bless you. In response, our housing plan, we launched a housing plan to create 53,000 units of new housing by the year 2030. In 5 years, we've produced nearly 28,000 new homes. We have about 25,000 in the permitting process. And we raised our housing goal from 53,000 by 2030 to 69,000 houses by 2030. By the end of this year, we will have created more affordable homes than any other 4-year period on record here in the city of Boston. That allows us to maintain our national leadership with 20% of our housing stock income restricted. So we need to continue to move forward there. We've joined neighboring cities and towns and launched a regional housing plan. One of the things, Boston's about 700,000 people. You look at some of the cities that you represent are bigger than that. When you think of greater Boston, we go to 2.2 million people. We sat down with the mayors from the surrounding cities and towns and we said, we need to create more economic opportunities and more housing for folks, more middle class and low income housing. And we sat down and we talked about a plan and we came up with a regional plan because we have a regional housing shortage as well. And our goal is 185,000, God bless you, 185,000 new units by the year 2030. So when you think of what we have, that includes our 69,000. So we're really laser focused on that. We're finding creative ways to invest in public housing in an area that the federal government is limiting its role. And this has been going on for about 10 years where the federal government has been divesting, if you will, out of public housing. And we're working right now in the city to renovate a lot of our public housing developments to make sure that people have an opportunity to live in a good, clean, environmentally friendly, safe place. And we're working in public-private partnerships to make that happen. We're using funds from the sale of city property. We had a garage in the downtown Boston called Winthrop Square. We sold it for $160 million. It was literally a garage that was abandoned and boarded up. And there's going to be a development on there. We got $160 million, $102 million up front, $60 million at the sale of the condos and when the office gets full. And we're going to earn about $14 to $15 million a year on real estate tax, property tax. It's going to go into our coffers. We took the $102 million and we invested that money, $25 million into renovating Boston Common, the first public park in the United States of America, $25 million into renovating Franklin Park, $25 million into completing Old Colony housing development in South Boston, $10 million to completing the Orient Heights housing development in East Boston. We're going to put $11 million to close the Emerald Necklace to make sure that Olmsted's vision is going to be complete in Emerald Necklace. And we put $5 million into the Rose Candy Greenway, which used to be the Central Artery Project. And we're making these one-time investments in our open space and in housing, making sure the money from that garage is going towards helping people. And that's something that's important for us. But when we talk about mobility, subsidized housing is only part of the answer. We want people on a pathway to middle class. That's something that I know that EMPath understands because you've been working with us as a partner. In 2016, we won a $30 million federal grant to rebuild the Whittier housing development in Roxbury, something that I was excited about. It allowed us to rebuild over 200 deeply subsidized units and add over 200 moderate units of housing. It also helped us integrate healthcare, job access, youth programming, senior programming, open space. It's a total neighborhood vision. It was done under the Obama administration. I'll tell you a quick side story. So President Obama awarded us late at the end of his term. It was about November. And if you remember, in January, when the new president came in, he went after immigrants and Muslims. So we held a press conference in my office to kind of fight back what was coming out of Washington. And literally the next day, we were doing a groundbreaking at Whittier Street. And I was there, and Billy McGonigal, who's the director, I was thinking as I was going to Whittier Street, I wonder if we have the check yet. And when I got there, I said, did we get the check yet? He goes, the president sent it on his last day. I'm like, beautiful. Just in case. But let me just, EMPath is an organization supporting our residents during the renovation. And you've been a big partner there, so I want to thank you for that. And you're not just helping us, but you're helping us getting residents ready to return, to expanding their options. This summer, I had the honor of being with a former Whittier Street resident named Patricia Brown. She became a homeowner for the first time. Thanks to a partnership between the Department of Neighborhood Development and the caring staff of EMPath, I got to visit Patricia and her family. I even played some basketball with her 9-year-old grandson in a Nerf hoop in his bedroom. He didn't have a bedroom before. They didn't have a safe place. They didn't have their own keys. They didn't have their own place. This was their own house. And I was watching their faces that day and seeing the smile on their face, thinking to myself, we need to do more of this so people call it their home. They're not renting, they're owning. And it's so important for us that we do that. I got to see the pride in that family's face. And I had a chance to see the pride in the people that helped make that happen. The staff at D&D and the staff at EMPath and all the other folks that were there, seeing people smiling, understanding that the work that we're doing is working. And it's important for us that we do that. When I started my second term this year as mayor, I said Boston is a city that's world-class because it works for the middle class. Those can't be words on a speech, on a piece of paper given in a speech. That has to be the reality. We have to make sure that our cities across America are working for the middle class. And we have to make sure that we're helping people get into that middle class. Access and mobility were fundamental to the concept of the American middle class. It was what my parents experienced when they came from Ireland. My father came in 1956, and my mother came in 1959. They came to this country to send money home, really, and they ended up staying here. Because my father was able to become a laborer, he was able to buy a home. In 1967, my mother and myself, I was born, we moved into the house that we bought the same day. My mother is still in that house today. My father died in that house 8 years ago. But it's because of the opportunity that was presented to them of the American dream. And this American dream that we used to think about, we need to make sure that it still exists. And the people in this room understand that. That's what we have to get to. We've learned that we can never take anything for granted. The middle class didn't happen by accident, and it won't come back by accident. It's going to take hard work. It's going to take leadership. It's going to take political participation from people who actually care. We need to make sure that people understand that. On Tuesday, we have an election coming. Change is possible. It's important to make sure that we send a message to people to say, you need to stand up and speak up and step up with the people that need the help. I know that we have big challenges, but I've seen us reverse the trend here in Boston. I know that we can do it in every single city and town all across America. Now when we start moving forward again as a country, a lot of leaders are going to take credit. And none of them will remember to thank the people who laid the foundation, the people in this room who laid that foundation. So I want to say thank you. Thank you to each and every single one of you that are here today for your research, your innovation, your advocacy, and your commitment to the people that you serve, and even the people that you don't realize that you're helping. I want to thank you for the impact that you've already made. I want to thank you for advancing the work here in the city of Boston. And I just want to say, don't get down, because all it takes is one person to make a difference. And when I look out at this room, I see a lot of individuals, but I also see a collective group of people that love the work that you do. So I want to thank you for that. And thank you for the even greater impact that you're going to have in the future. I hope you have a great conference here in the city of Boston. I hope you enjoy the city in Boston. And lastly, welcome to the city of Boston.
Good morning. My name is Donna Jeffers, and I'm a board member of EMPath. And I have a great job this morning. I get to introduce Chuck Collins. Chuck Collins was born into the 1%. He's the great-grandson of Oscar Mayer. At the age of 26, he gave away his entire inheritance. And he devoted himself to working for economic and social justice. Pretty interesting story to start with, is it not? I first met Chuck by reading his book, Born on Third Base. I love the title, because the title is so classy about what we do not recognize about so many opportunities and advantages that many of us have. In Born on Third Base, Chuck challenges the wealthy to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. He doesn't demonize the wealthy. He made me think about that a lot. He has founded many organizations to engage the wealthy, to challenge the wealthy, to address all of the inequalities in our society. One of them is the Wealth for Common Good, a network of business leaders, high-income households, and partners working to promote shared prosperity and fair taxation. He has also worked with Bill Gates to promote and advocate for taxing inherited wealth. In his newest book, Is Inequality in America Irreversible?, Chuck describes the policy and the power dynamics that have advanced the wealthy at the expense of the 99%. He makes a very compelling case for why extreme inequities in the United States is threatening our democracy, and it's just not good for everyone. His analysis of wealth, to me, is deeply disturbing. His description of the unrecognized ways our government aids and abets the accumulation of wealth is really eye-opening. His strategies and ideas for reversing this trend are exciting, and they're really encouraging. Chuck is currently director of the Program on Inequality and the Common Good at the Institute for Policy Studies, which is based in Washington and has a Boston office. Chuck is an author, he's an advocate, he's a patriot, he's an educator, he's a researcher, he's a community organizer. To me, he is an inspiration, and I trust he will be to you as well.
Good morning. Thanks to the EMPath team and Beth and Mary Coleman and others that I've gotten to know. Last night I got home. I wasn't able to be with you yesterday. I was in Washington. I got home at about 10 o'clock, and I went out to my garden and cut a couple of marigolds that were still alive to build our Day of the Dead altar, our ofrenda. And on that altar, I have a picture that I brought, a very important person named Diana, who I want to share as a gratitude story to EMPath, because in 1959, at the age of 18, Diana was raped. She got pregnant. She did not have a lot of options. She chose to keep the child. She was, as a result of that, shunned and shamed out of her house in Needham, and went to live at the Crittenden Hastings house, where she gave birth to her first child, and was able to grow up with other mothers and in a supportive community. And Crittenden Hastings House is, one of the organizations that is merged to create today's EMPath. Diana is my mother-in-law. She is my wife's mother. And she's on our altar because she's no longer with us, but she is the grandmother to Caleb and Sam. So that's a gratitude. I want to thank Crittenden Hastings, the previous generations that built that institution that offered her a sanctuary in that time. And I want to congratulate you all for being here and the conversation about narrative, about stories, because as we know, it isn't just about having a great policy idea. It isn't necessarily about sort of being effective advocates. We're up against powerful stories, powerful narratives that justify and hold this poverty and inequality in place. And so the fact that you're spending this time really sort of looking at that practice, I think is right on inspiring, and I want to add to that conversation. And part of what I want to bring to this is my belief that we can't really challenge the mythologies and stories that justify or hold poverty in place without also looking at the stories of advantage, the stories that we tell as a culture about wealth and the realities of how wealth is actually created. Without disrupting that story, we're not going to be able to come together to tell a true story about poverty, inequality, and opportunity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I call the top end of the dynamic, if you will. And as Donna said, I grew up in a wealthy family. My great-grandfather was the meat packer, Oscar Mayer. So I had a lot of bologna, growing up. My father used to say, bringing home the bacon had a different meaning in our family. But I grew up in a suburb of Detroit. I went to a private boys' school, Cranbrook School. Happens to be the same high school where Mitt Romney went. He was a couple years older than me. Our school motto was aim high. Think of this as a boys' prep school in the sort of Georgetown prep mold, if you will. Aim high was the school motto, which today is still depicted by an archer shooting an arrow straight up into the air, which, if you think about it, it's not anything we would allow our children to do. I grew up in a bubble of advantage, of privilege, of wealth. And one of the first disruptions to that bubble was in 1967. At the age of 7, there was the riots in Detroit, the uprising, if you will, in Detroit. And I was pestering my parents, what's going on? Why is this happening? And my mother, who comes from a very different background, kind of a working class sensibility, said, this is because things are not fair in this city. And that planted a seed in my mind, like, oh, she's talking about that gap between city and suburb where we live, rich and poor, white and black. That's how I, in my 7-year-old mind, understood it. And that planted a seed that got me interested in these issues of inequality and understanding all was not well in my little bubble of the world. My first job, real job, was I worked with tenants trying to buy their apartment buildings. And I worked with mobile home park tenants around New England who own their mobile homes but didn't own the land under their homes and therefore were very vulnerable when that land came up for sale. And I worked with tenant groups to organize themselves to buy those parks and own them as resident-owned cooperatives. And one of the groups I worked with just did the 125th resident buyout of a mobile home park in New Hampshire. So that's tens of thousands of people now who own a modest home and also control the land under their houses. But at that time, I was a young, privileged, wealthy young man working anonymously doing this work. And I have to tell you, I learned a lot about people sticking together, about people organizing and solidarity. And it kind of disrupted my own understanding of the world because I had grown up in a community where people were generous and charitable, but I had never seen reciprocity, mutuality, solidarity, and I wanted what those folks had that I didn't have. I wanted to live in a community where people were all in for each other. And I kind of came to the understanding that the wealth I had in my name was an impediment to my being able to have those kind of relationships. So I made this decision to give away this wealth that Donna talked about. And I'm not going to say much about that, except you can imagine I wrote my parents a letter thanking them for the opportunities I'd been given, including being able to go to college without debt, which is, as we know today, a huge advantage. And my father, called me up and he said, "You haven't given away the money yet, have you?" And I said, "No." He says, "Well, I really want to talk to you about this momentous decision." And he came out here to Boston and we walked around and we had a good talk. And he said, "You grew up in a bubble. You don't really understand the value of this money. You're single, you're young, you probably think you're going to live forever. But bad things can happen. And what if someday you're in a relationship and your partner is sick? Won't you wish you had that money? And or what if someday you have a child and that child has a special need? Aren't you going to wish you had that cushion of money?" And I said, "Well, I have thought about that, and then I think I would be in the same boat as 99% of the people I know. I would have to get help. I would have to lean on my community and my congregation and he said, "Yeah, but in the end, you would probably have to depend on government, and that's a lousy and tattered safety net." To which I replied, "Well, then I would have a real personal stake in making sure that's a better safety net." To which he wisely replied, "Oi, you're giving me a headache. You're so idealistic." But my father's turned 87 yesterday, remarkable guy. At that moment, he said, "I love you, man. I get it. Do what you have to do. No strings attached." And I gave away that money. And the thing that was funny, in that moment, I actually thought I was making this momentous decision. I had no idea, to be honest. This is a little embarrassing. I had no idea how much other advantage I had hardwired into my life. 4 generations of economic stability. A German, growing up in a white European immigrant family where when they opened up a butcher shop in Chicago and catered to the German community, there were no pogroms disrupting their business district as there were in African American business districts. Growing up with a family with a family safety net in the event that somebody had a mental illness or an addiction or a challenge, that family safety net was there. Being male, going to a school with a motto, aim high, being told that I have agency and that I'm expected to play a role in society. All the social networks, all the financial literacy, all the 101 ways in which advantage just gets wired into the life of someone like me. I had no idea. I don't have to worry about my parents economically. I can worry about them, but think about, what an advantage that is, unlike so many of my friends who are trying to raise children and care for elder parents. And I say that because part of the narrative of poverty, part of how we're going to challenge that is to understand all the ways advantage works, all the ways in which multi-generational Head Starts work to contribute to what I would now call the new physics of inequality. We're now living in a moment where there are compounding, accelerating advantages for people in the top 10%. And compounding disadvantages, not just for low-income people, but for about 60% of the population. And that is, if we don't understand that and can't tell true stories about how advantage works, we're not going to be able to really get at the narratives that hold poverty in place. I had an intimate front row seat in the 1980s to these inequalities as they started to open up. I saw low-wage tenants trying to survive as wages started to flatten out. And I also had a front row seat to wealth creating wealth. Coming from a born-on-third-base family, I could see how wealth was compounding. People would say things like, "Yeah, we just sold the house that we bought for X for 50X." Or our investment fund is getting a 25% return on investment. Oh, assets are booming. Wealth is booming. Wages are flat. Well, where are we today? What's the picture today? You know the story. I'm not going to dwell on it much. I mean, we're living in a time of extraordinary, extreme inequality. We're now in the fourth decade of pretty much flat, stagnant wages. You know, you see in the news recently, the median wage has gone up 2.5%, and we're all happy about that. That's a good trend, but we're still, for half the population, trying to get back to what real wages were worth 4 decades ago, before the internet. Half the population has not shared in the productivity gains since the late 70s. And that tells us a lot about what we're living through right now. But the other piece of the picture is what's happening at the top. You know, most people understand that we're living in unequal times, but I bet you probably don't understand, how extreme things have become. Most of the wealth gains and growth of income in the last 10 years has gone not to the top 1%, but the top 1/10 of 1%. Those are households with wealth at about 20 million and up, income at about 2.5 million and up. That's where most of the growth in income and wealth is going. And the higher we go up the economic ladder, the more concentrated that wealth is. 400 families, the 400 wealthiest families in the United States, have as much wealth combined as the bottom 64% of households combined. How is that possible? It is because of the growing ranks of underwater nation. 1 out of 5 households, 0 or negative net worth. 1 out of 3 African American households, 0 or negative worth. 27% of Latino households, 0 or negative worth. And the next fifth up is precarious, has very little to fall back on. So we don't even get to a positive net worth significantly till about the 40th percentile. That's how wealth, and we're seeing what I call dynastic wealth, the growth of wealth dynasties, families that instead of seeing their wealth disperse over generations, the wealth is growing. The Mars Candy family, the Gallo, the Koch family, and the Walton family, the 3 wealthiest families in the United States. In 1982 till the present, their wealth has, as a group, factoring in inflation, increased 6,000%. That's not a typo. We just did the study. You can find it at inequality.org. 3 families since 1982, a 6,000 increase in their wealth, at the same time that the median wealth went down 3% for the rest of the country. That's the moment we're living in. It's a period of extreme and extraordinary inequality, and if we put a racial lens on it, it becomes more extreme. If we put a gender lens on it, it becomes more extreme. You get the picture, though. You know, the median white wealth is 35 times the median African American wealth. So we're living in a time of hyper extreme inequality. And isn't it interesting that the stories of inequality and the story and what I call the myth of deservedness seem to grow during times of inequality even more? We'll come back to that. That's the present. If we don't intervene, as the French economist Thomas Piketty says, if we don't intervene, we're going to become a nation of hereditary wealth and power, where the sons and daughters of today's billionaires will dominate our politics, culture, and philanthropy and the economy. So we are moving toward a sort of racial and economic apartheid society. We know why this matters. There's now a mountain of research showing that this imbalance of income and wealth and opportunity undermines our democracy. It leads to breakdowns in social cohesion. It creates a polarized politics. It's bad for the economy. It's bad for social mobility and opportunity. If you're not born rich, if you're not born in the top 5th and you want the American dream, you're better off moving to Canada, because the American dream, because social mobility now is 3 times higher in Canada. So these are the impacts of these inequalities. We know something about what to do. We heard from Mayor Walsh talking about the golden age of growing a middle class. And we know that there are things that we can do to create a shared prosperity economy, to lift people out of poverty and into the middle class. I don't usually do imitations, but let me offer my very best Bernie Sanders. Under the socialist presidency of Dwight Eisenhower, the wealthiest 1% paid 3 times more in income tax, twice as much in inheritance tax. It was invested in debt-free college, first-time homebuyer, low-interest loans, infrastructure that benefited everyone. Right? So what's he saying? He's saying we used to have a much more progressive tax system, and we used to invest in things that move people forward. I have an uncle, not from the wealthy part of my family, who bought a farm in 1950 with a 1% fixed rate 40-year mortgage through Farmers Home. Pretty good. Think of the generation that could be launched. We put 13 million people into first-time homebuyer loans, Veterans Administration loans, FHA mortgage loans. 13 million people, almost all of them white, got on the express train to the middle class with deeply subsidized private mortgages, publicly subsidized mortgages. Meanwhile, blacks, Latinos, First Nations, others were left at the station because of the legacy, because of the actual discrimination in mortgage lending, were not able to take advantage of those same programs. But we know something about the kinds of investments lessons we can apply. We know that there are countries that have considerably less inequality because they both have a much higher floor of decency. Think of the Nordic countries, a floor through which people don't fall all the way to destitution, where there's decent living wages and universal education and access to lifelong learning. We know the formula. But we are up against all kinds of mythologies and narratives. The reason it's hard to build wide public support or support among powerful people is because of those stories. The good news is there is a realignment happening. People overwhelmingly believe we should have much higher wages. We shouldn't have this scourge of college debt. We should be investing in low-income families. We should redirect housing subsidies that mostly go to the rich to help low and middle-income people get access to decent housing. We know overwhelmingly people support having the wealthy pay a higher fair share of their taxes and make these kinds of investments. It's wildly popular at the base, and that's part of the work. But part of our work, part of the boulder, is the stories. I tell these facts to some of my friends, and they say, well, these inequalities, that's a little troubling, but the people who have that kind of wealth deserve to have what they have. They work harder. They create value for the society. Anybody ever heard that? That's the other side, the corollary of the mythology about wealth. I would describe it in a bumper sticker this way: everyone is where they deserve to be. If you think that, if that is your dominant story, if that's the lens through which you look at all the data in the world, isn't going to change your mind. The oil billionaire J. Paul Getty was once asked, how do you become wealthy in America? And he said, it's really simple. There's 3 things we have to do, and we can do a poll here. 1, get up early every morning. How many of you got up early this morning? 2, work hard all day, including going to like a conference, right? Yeah. 3, find oil. So people hear these statistics about inequality, and they say, some people got up early. Some people worked hard all day. Some people created a new mousetrap. Some people took risks. And other people didn't. And the shadow corollary of that is what you're grappling with. That sort of like, there's not, that there's something deserving, there's something lacking on the other end of the story. So how do we change that? How do we disrupt those stories? Let me offer an example. a couple of years ago, I was part of an effort to defend the federal estate tax, the tax on inherited wealth. And that's where I got to know Bill Gates' dad. And we were very involved in doing press conferences around the country. And at one of the press conferences to defend this inheritance tax, we got 1,500 multimillionaires and billionaires to publicly come out in defense of the estate tax. So one of them showed up at this press conference, somebody I'd never met. His name was Martin. And he got up at the press conference, and this is what he said. He says, I grew up in a low-income community. My parents worked every hour that they could find work, but sometimes they didn't have work. We never took a vacation as a family. We struggled. But I actually went to a pretty good elementary school. And I went to a library that was open in the evening, every evening till 9 o'clock. It was open on the weekends, and that library was like a sanctuary for me. And there was this librarian there who took an interest in me, and every time I came in there, she said, Martin, I have a book for you. Here's a book of experiments you could do in your apartment without burning it down. She knew I was interested in science. Here's a biography of a scientist. Martin says, my family had no money, but somebody else paid for me to have access to a good education. And I went to a great high school, and I had science teachers that got me excited, and I was able to go to college for free. Someone else paid for me to be able to go to college. And then I went into the field of the emerging technologies of the internet. And where did which was largely built through public investments. And I started a company. Where did I hire my workers? I hired them from the great university down the road that trained my workers in the foundation of knowledge that they would need to work for me. So I didn't actually, someone else paid for that. And even my company, somebody stole my intellectual property, and the United States went to the global tribunal and defended my property against an international company and saved my business. So Martin sort of looks out at this audience. He says, so last year, I sold my company for $30 million. And I have several other companies worth the same amount. And Martin says, but, if you abolish this tax, what you're essentially saying is I have no responsibility to pay back the society that made it almost entirely possible for me to get where I am. And at this point in the press conference, to everyone's shock, he starts to pound the podium. He says, actually, I have a moral obligation to pay back in the event that somebody else out there, born into the same humble circumstances as me, should have the same opportunities I had. Because what makes America good is when we recycle opportunity. And if you have 10 million or 20 million or 50 billion, you didn't do it alone. And Martin was clear. He says, I'm not taking away from individuals. In fact, we should celebrate individuals who get up early, take risks, work hard, celebrate, reward. But let's not lose sight of the web of commonwealth that makes it all possible. And let's understand that you can't just pull up the rug. You can't just pull up the ladder once you get to that level. You have an obligation to recycle opportunity so that others can have the same opportunities you had. And everybody was like, whoa. How often do you hear that story? But actually, I can tell you, I hear that story all the time because part of the work that we do to disrupt these narratives around poverty and inequality is to develop messengers who can talk about the web, to talk about the commonwealth, the public investments that make it all possible for us to be able to move forward. It's not just wealthy people, too. I was at the Norwood Men's Club, the Retired Men's Club of Norwood, a veterans association. 150 men, World War II veterans, Korean War veterans. I said, I'm just curious, how many of you, 150 men, all of European heritage, how many of you got a debt-free college education after World War II? 3/4 raised their hand. How many of you were able to get a first-time homebuyer program, to become the first person in your family to buy a home thanks to a government mortgage, Veterans Administration, FHA, Farmers Home? 3/4 of the men in the room raised their hand. I said, how many of you think that was a waste of taxpayer money? They all laughed. They were like, no, that was the magic carpet out of poverty. That was the magic carpet to the middle class. And I said, so how many of you are helping your kids today? They all raised their hand. They're all helping their kids. Do your children understand that they're the beneficiary of government subsidies from 2 generations ago that made it possible for them to be where they are, to be able to buy a home in their area? One guy said, yeah, I'm the parental down payment assistance program. It's the only way my kids can buy a house and stay in the community. What my message to them was, you have to tell that story. You have to go public with that story. You have to talk about all the ways you got help. And I think this is sort of a key to this narrative problem. There's something about help. Even with that group, I said subsidy. They said, oh, subsidy, that's a dirty word. We have to talk about family help, government help, the ways in which an older generation benefited. It's something that anyone can do. It's something that most white people can find in their own biographical narrative, some ways in which the legacy of racism stopped some people but propelled others. Tell true stories of how advantage works. That is one of the ways that we can disrupt these narratives. And I was sad that we're not, yeah, thank you. I was sad that we're not voting on Tuesday here in Massachusetts. We had an initiative, what was called the millionaire tax. Increase the income tax on incomes over $1 million by 4%, dedicated to education and transportation. And the opposition understood that this was going to pass, and they used their legal powers to knock it off the ballot. But I was excited about that campaign because we had lined up UMass alumni in their 60s and 70s, people who would be identified as icons of success in today's economy, who were going to stand up and say, the Commonwealth invested in me. It's time for us to continue that investment. That part of how we were going to disrupt the narrative was to have people talk about how these public investments transformed their own lives and made a huge difference. And part of it is getting people to get beyond that stigma of help and admitting that they got help. And I have to say, it seems like us men in particular have a hard time with that. My experience is women see the web. They see the web of supports that make it possible. And we men like to sort of feel like, hey, we got here on our own. And I'm like, really? You were born in a state of nature, raised by wolves, Did you have a mother? Did you have a teacher, a mentor, a coach, anybody along the way there? No, I got here on my own. And I think that's a key, an insight into that. The more we can get people to talk about how advantage works, the more that's going to help our discussions about how we disrupt these inequalities. Let me stop there because I know we have a break coming up, but thank you for your...
Can't let him off that easily. That's not fair. Yes. Way in the back.
Thank you for being here. I'm a part-time student at
Louder.
Maxwell's.
We can't hear you.
I'm a part-time student at Maxwell's School of Citizenship and Policy, in addition to my work in human services. What I'm finding as a local political advocate is that if people have listened to a particular media source that rhymes with box, they have a particular perspective that they are chanting at me. And so my question is, how do we thwart the really well-funded media streams that are propelling this narrative forward that is about individuals need to pull up their bootstraps and work hard themselves, and if they fail, it's their fault?
I mean, I think that we're up against, as you're saying, we're up against sort of an organized narrative distribution network on one side. Part of it is to realize, there's some people that are pretty locked up with their narrative, the individual. But most people, if you engage them with with questions like, did you get any help? Did you get any help? And sort of tease that out. Well, what does that mean? Did your family help you in any way? Did you, because part of what, now we have it from the top down. We have a president who says he's a self-made billionaire. And then we just realized, okay, you got a $413 million head start. Or, you're running for this, you're on the Supreme Court and you say, how did you get into Yale? I busted my tail. Oh, and by the way, my grandfather went to Yale too. We have this like almost purposeful amnesia or mystification. So on the one hand, I think we have to sort of call that out, if you will, and say, what's happening there is advantaged people rewriting their own stories, leaving out some very important narrative elements, and therefore basically saying, hey, anybody can do what I did. Anybody can do what I did. And that's where I think there is journalism and narrative work and investigative work to sort of demystify and debunk that. And then on a more community level or interactive level, I think it's engaging people around what help transformed your life. Because even our business journalism is always about, tell us the story, Donna, of how you built the XYZ company through your own character and grit. And actually, there might be some character and grit involved in that. We don't want to diminish that. But let's talk about the fertile ground that we created together that made that possible. And name it, describe it, talk about all the components. I think that will help us in this contested narrative space.
One more question? Yeah. Sorry to point, but...
Might come in your way.
Hi. I'm curious, so yesterday a lot of the conversation focused on asset building and helping people build up some savings. For example, one of the panelists who works with EMPath, part of that work includes saving up, more than $3,000, which is great. That's already a household that's doing better than the 20% of negative or no net worth that you mentioned. So I'm curious, what would you say to someone who says, the solution is just let's help build people's assets. Let's just help build people's net worth from the bottom, and we don't need to address the top. What do you say to people who say it's not about that gap between the 1% and everyone else? It's about just kind of helping raise that level up from the bottom and making that better.
Yeah. About 10 years ago, you heard more of that, and we still hear it. Poverty matters, but does it really matter how much wealth the wealthy have? Are you just fomenting class war and resentment here? And here's the thing. I don't have the time to go through the research, but let me just assure you, there is a mountain of research that basically shows how concentrations of wealth and power are disrupting our ability to address all the key problems. So yeah, we might be able to say, let's design a bottom-up asset building program. But that is not going to be a substitute. This is the bad news or the challenge, if you will. We're not going to be able to alleviate poverty in an economy that is now baked in. These inequalities, these concentration of wealth features are baked into the economy. Wealth is going to be funneling upwards. That's going to create disruption. Mayor Walsh talked about the building boom in Boston. But there's a huge luxury real estate boom that is actually disrupting our city's ability to address the affordable housing crisis. We're not going to be able to, I think the city, we're lucky to have the mayor and the city that we have because they're doing yeoman's work to kind of pull out a piece of that subsidy, taxing, or negotiating linkage fees and the like. But we're really actually not going to solve the problem by just letting things go on autopilot at the top. So we are going to have to intervene in the cycles of inequality at the concentrated wealth level. We're going to have to prevent the creation of dynastic wealth, and that's more challenging. But So unfortunately, it's not enough to just work on raising the floor. That's not going to address the way the economy now is wired to perpetuate the current inequalities. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you.